Awesome. So, Anna, what we typically do is when we've had speakers, they share for 30 minutes and then there'd be a Q&A. But since we ended up submitting the questions already to the group and to you, you can direct this however you wish. And
yeah,
let's just go from there.
I mean, let's get right into the Q&A. I thought it was such good questions, and let's just have a discussion. That'd be awesome.
Okay. They're going to be the same questions that I sent you. Would you like me to read them off and let's go from there?
Sure. I mean, I can pull them up. I have them on my computer. If you want to just read them one at a time, that'd be super.
Okay, great. Okay, so the first one, describe the differences between a dopamine hit from sex inside a committed relationship, sex outside of a committed relationship, masturbation, watching porn, or watching porn while masturbating. If there are any, do the differences make any difference?
Yeah. So great question. There are no scientific studies that I'm aware of that have actually, looked at that using the scientific method. But I think we can make some inferences. And of course, I have, a wealth of clinical experience. And I would say it depends. And it depends on a couple of things. It depends first on that individual and kind of what gives them pleasure, because people are different, and what gives one person pleasure may not necessarily give another person pleasure. And then it also depends on prior exposure and whether or not that person has already gotten addicted to some form of sexual activity. Because of course, that puts us physiologically, brain-wise, into a different kind of place where our reactions and responses are going to be influenced by the kinds of neural networks that we've created based on past experience. So there's not an easy way to answer that, and it's very individual dependent. And even outside of the context of addiction, I mean, it's very clear that, dopamine is triggered by novelty, and in a committed relationship, that inevitably is going to be not novel after a while. And so, the pleasure that we get from that experience is, when things are going well, going to change over time, so that it's not so much about the orgasm, but about the trust and respect and the loyalty and all of those things, those sort of intangibles that come over time in a committed relationship, that may be expressed through sex, but are not typically specifically about the sex. So that was probably a super unsatisfactory answer for folks. So I'm happy to sort of let's have a little discussion about it, or maybe there are some follow-up questions, or maybe I didn't even understand the question.
No, that was good. So can there be more dopamine as intimacy it grows?
So, I mean, here's the thing about dopamine. It's neither good nor bad. It's a chemical that our brain makes, which is fundamental to our survival. It is acutely sensitive to pleasure, reward, motivation, and novelty. It can also be released when we experience some kind of pain. So it's not just associated with pleasure. We all have tonic baseline levels of dopamine firing. So that's at baseline. We probably have different baselines. And the addiction loop is all about doing something that causes an increase temporarily in baseline levels of dopamine that is reinforcing, pleasurable for us, however you define that. And that can be experienced in so many different ways, right? It's not just about euphoria. It can be just about numbing ourselves or escaping, or not feeling some pain or whatever it is. But whatever it is, it does the trick for us, such that we want to repeat that behavior. But then if we continue to do that, repeatedly, again, what happens is that initial response gets weaker and shorter. The after response, which is that dopamine deficit state, which is the way that our brains correct after a dopamine surge, gets stronger and longer. And so, inevitably that thing is no longer pleasurable in the way that it was. And I can't remember, what was your follow-up question? I like lost the thread.
Oh, it's okay. Oh, just if becoming more intimate with inside of a relationship would have any effect on dopamine.
Yeah. Okay. So intimacy, I mean, I'm assuming that all of these questions are in the context of sex addiction. So, I mean, sex addiction is like the antithesis of intimacy, right? It's the way that we take care of ourselves. It's not really about the other person typically. I mean, there may be aspects of the chase or the actual interaction which are important to the way that we, get our own reward or take care of ourselves. But it's not really fostering intimacy. I mean, intimacy is this thing that's really, I mean, I'd really be curious to hear what other people think, but I think intimacy isn't really sort of orthogonal or even antithetical to that chasing that pleasure for its own sake. Because intimacy is, intimacy in a committed relationship is about taking care of that other person as much as it's about taking care of ourselves. It's not necessarily about physical pleasure, although if physical pleasure is there, that's very nice. There is an element of like sacrifice that I think is part of intimacy. It's just, I mean, at the end of the day, I really don't, something I say to patients is that what people who don't understand sex addiction don't appreciate is that sex addiction really isn't about sex. At the end of the day, it's really about self-soothing or coping. And in a way, it's really about escaping. So intimacy is the opposite of that. Intimacy is really about not escaping, about trying to be present, fully present, in the moment, with our partners, which is hard and, requires some sacrifice and is not necessarily like all that much sexual pleasure, but still potentially worth it, right? If it grows intimacy in the relationship. I don't know. What do people think? Those are my thoughts. I'd be really curious to hear what others think.
Well, we have them on mute except for a few people that if we have some extra questions. Are you okay with us just continuing with the questions?
Sure. I mean, I defer to you all. If you don't normally open it up to discussion, you don't have to do that. On the other hand, I mean, I think discussion is great. So if people feel comfortable, talking, but if that's not your format, I don't want to, mess with your format.
It's typically our format. But in the interest of time, I'm hearing you speak. We had a group conscience and then had set out the questions some weeks prior. So it's all come from the fellowship. So.
Got it.
Okay, what is the difference between a dopamine hit from visual stimulation and one from physical stimulation?
So again, I think lots of inter-individual differences. Some people really are intensely visually stimulated, and we know that, visual images go right to our visual cortex, which is tied into the reward pathway. So for visual people, visual images can be incredibly potent. For others, that's maybe not as big a part of it, and it's the physical reward or the physical stimulation that's more important. So I just think really depends on the person. There's enormous inter-individual variability when it comes to reinforcing substances and behaviors. From an evolutionary perspective, that kind of makes sense, right? Like if everybody was going for the same exact rewards, it wouldn't be good collectively for the group. But if people are, turned on, let's say, by different types of things, then that means that we've got a lot of people going for different types of rewards. That kind of ensures that as a group, we will sort of have everything that we need.
Okay, great. Hey, how can how can people who are single in Spaa stay sober?
Right. So, I mean, I think
Or-
that, you know, 12 steps is really good here. The basic principles of honesty are really important, you know, especially kind of radical honesty, being ruthlessly honest about every little thing. I think it's really important to avoid drugs and alcohol, because even if drugs and alcohol aren't your thing, that can disinhibit you, so that you're not able to stay in your sober place around you know, your sexual addiction. And then I think really being very clear about what your values are, and you know, trying to really live and move and interact within those values. And then I think also regularly checking in with your fellowship, however you define that, whether that's your sponsor or your group, or you know, a sober friend or your intimate partner. Well, I guess if you're single, but you know, you can have friends and family members. So you know, there's not sort of one magic thing, but it's kind of all the things that you would guess.
Okay. Um, so what do you say to your teenage children when you know they're watching pornography? What do you tell a 10-year-old, 7 or 8?
Well, I think it's very important that for preteens, we try to really limit their exposure to those images. I really don't think that they're able to process those images, which is why my recommendation broadly to parents is to not allow their children to have personal devices until at least age 13 or 14. And when there is screen time, to make sure that it's together with a parent or other caregiver. I mean, one of the things I do talk about in my book is the situation of an 8-year-old boy who got, you know, his parents were very busy, and they gave him an iPad, and he found, you know, images of Japanese anime of, you know, sodomy, and then he started to sodomize his brother, and that's why it came to the attention of legal authorities. And you know, totally sweet, natural, normal little kid who saw an image and thought, well, that looks interesting, I think I'll give that a try. So, you know, and that can happen in a home and in a family, even where kids are not exposed to those images, because they're curious about their bodies and how things work and want to know how the plumbing works, and there's a hole, and you know, that makes sense. So, and that doesn't make that child like deviant or awful or anything like that. That's sort of normal development. And in particular, interestingly, there is a phase that many children have gone through, and that's been for several generations prior to the advent of the internet and online pornography, especially among young boys, where they experimented with homosexual encounters, even when they weren't themselves, they didn't later identify as being homosexual. So this is sort of kind of normal, like curiosity, which, you know, parents and caregivers have to monitor and then educate kids about what's appropriate touch in terms of how they can touch and how they can be touched. So I think part of doing that responsibly is really making sure that our kids, as soon as in the time that we still have control over what they do, which is, you know, about 12 and under, that they don't have access to those devices. Beyond that, you know, they will look at pornography. I don't really think it's possible to limit or monitor what kids look at once they get their devices. Unfortunately, it's just impossible to do that. So I think instead it has to be, you know, a very open discussion about pornography and what it is and what it does, and about sex addiction and what can happen with repeated exposure to pornography and masturbation and online hookups and all that sort of thing. I mean, just, you know, in full disclosure, my now 18-year-old son, you know, it was clear to me that he was very early interested in sex, and relatively early was masturbating and looking at pornography. And, you know, I just really, all I could do was have an open discussion with him about that, and just say, you know, I just want you to be careful. You know, here are some of the consequences of that repeated exposure, and you know, all the things I talk about in my book, and he's read my book. And so, And then his, what was really sad to me was his very first sexual encounter was with somebody that he did not know and hooked up with on Tinder, which was something that I found out by overhearing him talking to his friends. And that was really, really sad for me. So I just sat down with him and I said, hey, I know this happened. And, I want you to know that for me, that's sad because, I'm hoping that for you, sex will be part of an intimate and caring relationship and not, a commodification with a stranger. And so we just had to talk about it, and actually what he said to me is, it wasn't all that. I'll never forget, Mom, it wasn't all that, So in other words, his experience wasn't that great. But it is really a different world. And so, we do have to parent, in that way. I guess it was, I think about, again, I would really be curious to hear from all of you, if you have kids and like how you were doing this and whether or not you're self-disclosing to your kids about your own struggles. I really believe in transparent parenting, and I think it's good to self-disclose. So.
Thank you. So let's have a quick group conscience with I got Ray and Bob on here, and you guys have any thoughts about switching up the format and opening this thing up?
Yeah.
Bob, you go first.
Okay. Well, we had a group conscience, Anna, and I'm Bob, and I'm a sex and porn addict. And for me in particular, what I need to do is we've got 1 hour worth of your time, and I would really like to stay focused on that. And I'm just going to be perfectly honest here. I've done these for, like a long time. And the problem with it is we have problems with boundaries. And so if we could just stay focused on the questions that we had, I know it's a little bit awkward, but I think that we would all be better for it. That's just my opinion. And that's why we have a group conscience, including you, by the way.
Okay, thank you.
Your turn, Ray.
Well, I agree with that because sometimes if we open it up to just discussion and we don't at least go through the raised hands feature, sometimes discussions can get far afield. And I'm with you. I think we have a limited amount of time. Let's stay focused.
Okay. I'm hearing you, and it makes sense. Part of your recovery practice is maintaining boundaries, and so keeping this bounded is part of what's good for you. So that makes total sense. Thank you. I guess I'm a little nervous because the questions are really good and also really hard, and I don't think I have very good answers. And there's not yet like a whole lot of concrete science. So what you're getting is sort of a mixture of my clinical experience and like my life philosophy. And I'm not sure that's all that helpful for you.
Oh, it is. What about this? What does a day of healthy dopamine usage look like?
Well, I have come to believe that the best way to get your dopamine is indirectly, meaning that it comes best through doing hard things. And for those of you who have read my book, you know that I use this metaphor of the balance. And, to me, one of the most interesting findings in neuroscience in the last 75 years is that the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like opposite sides of a balance, or what's called the opponent process mechanism. So when we do something pleasurable, it tilts to the side of pleasure. We do something painful, it tilts to the side of pain. But one of the overarching rules governing that balance is that with any deviation from neutrality to pleasure or pain, our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis. And the way the brain restores a level balance is by tilting an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. So if I have a piece of chocolate, I get a little release of dopamine, the pleasure neurotransmitter, in my brain's reward pathway, my balance tips to pleasure. But no sooner has that happened than my brain adapts to that dopamine by downregulating my own dopamine transmission and my own dopamine production, not just to baseline levels, but actually below baseline levels. One way to think about that is to imagine these little neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again, but they like it on the balance, so they stay on until it's tipped an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And that's the after effect, the come down, that moment of wanting one more piece of chocolate or one more YouTube video or wanting to look for, one more partner or one more form of sexual gratification. So if we wait long enough, those gremlins hop off and homeostasis is restored and that urge goes away. But if we continue to bombard our reward pathway with highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, we end up with so many gremlins on the pain side of the balance that we essentially are chronically tipped to the side of pain, because with repeated exposure to the same or similar stimuli, that after effect to the side of pain gets stronger and longer, the come down gets worse. And so people with addiction, that's what's happening in their brains. They've entered that chemical state where they've essentially changed their hedonic set point or their joy set point, so that now they're chronically tilted to the side of pain. Their gremlins, their neuroadaptation gremlins are camped out there, so to speak, tents and barbecues in tow. And now they need ever greater rewards, not even to feel pleasure, but just to right the balance and feel normal. And when they're not using, they're experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and intrusive thoughts of using. And their focus has narrowed down to just their drug of choice. And other things aren't rewarding, because when you're walking around with a balance like this and you eat a piece of chocolate, it's not going to do any good, right? There are too many gremlins on them. So the secret is to abstain for long enough for those gremlins to hop off and for our dopamine to start, making it normal levels, and for balance to be restored so that we can be in this supple place. And this is really what a healthy dopamine day or brain looks like, that we have a level balance, that it's supple. If you imagine a board, rather than imagining a scale or a teeter-totter, really the best analogy is a board on a ball. And we're standing on that board on the ball, and we're constantly having to readjust and make small micro adjustments so that we can keep that balance level. And it doesn't mean that we can't experience pleasure, but if we indulge in something that tips the balance to the side of pleasure, we have to make sure that it's not too much and not too frequently, right? We want to make sure we don't slam down, because then we're going to fall off our balance. Just if you imagine bouncing on a ball there. But also we don't want to do it so frequently that those neuroadaptation gremlins sort of start to camp out on the pain side. We want to leave enough time in between for those gremlins to hop off and for homeostasis to be restored. And it turns out that just like when we do something pleasurable, those gremlins hop on the pain side of the balance. It's true also that if we do something that's painful, so if that initial stimulus is painful, then those gremlins will hop on the pleasure side of the balance and actually reset our balance to the side of pleasure. And this is the science of hormesis, which is Greek for to set in motion. And basically, there's lots of science now showing that mild to moderate, noxious or painful stimuli tell our body that we need to start to make more of and upregulate our own endogenous feel-good hormones like dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, endocannabinoids, endopioids. So I think that a healthy dopamine day actually probably starts out, for me anyway, because I'm kind of chronically dysthymic. That's a psychiatric word that means just sort of naturally not that happy. That my day really has to start out with something painful. And that's a way that I physiologically trick my body into making more dopamine. So I almost always start my day with exercise. And what's amazing about this pleasure pain balance is that we have this incredibly vivid memory for the initial stimulus, whether it's pleasure or pain, but we're almost completely amnestic for the opponent process mechanism, which is the gremlins. I'll just give you two examples. I mean, one example is obviously with addiction, when we become addicted and we think about our use, almost the first thing that comes into mind is euphoric recall, as we remember how good it initially feels. So we have great memory for this. What we don't have good memory for is the gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance and all the like crappy feelings that come afterwards. But likewise, when that initial stimulus is pain, like with exercise, every single morning before I exercise, I have a very vivid memory for the pain of exercise, and I don't want to do it. And I'm incredibly amnestic for how good I feel after exercise, which is that opponent process. So we have to constantly remind ourselves about what we forget, right? And that we really have these incredible hippocampal tattoos for the initial stimulus, like the thing that was painful, or the thing that was instantly pleasurable, but we don't remember the opponent process. And we have to make sure that we remember that and then base our actions on that.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's good. So how would you say the 12 steps help change our mind and body with this disease?
Yeah, I think the 12 steps are absolutely amazing. And it's a spiritual transformation that I think really begins with this acknowledgement that we are not in control, and all the things that we thought we could manage and control, we can't control. And this pivot toward, just simply acknowledging that and humbling ourselves, really, it's really kind of crawling on our hands and knees in a way that's so painful. And unless you've been through it, it's really hard to explain to people, but it's just that moment when you just feel like, I give up. I clearly can't solve this problem, and I need help from something greater than myself. From a neurochemical or neurobiological point of view, and again, this is all sort of inferences based on my clinical experience, my life experience, and what I know about the neuroscience. But, if you think about that pleasure pain pathway or the reward pathway, it's in a very phylogenetically old part of our brain that's been conserved over millions of years of evolution and is completely unchanged across species. And it's that, evolutionary imprint to approach pleasure and avoid pain that works through this pleasure pain balance, which is this really interesting opponent process mechanism, which is a great system in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, but an absolutely horrible system in the world that we live in now. But we can't change it out. It is what it is. It's the same in a worm as it is in a human, and it's not going anywhere. And it's totally and completely reflexive. So that's the other thing to respect. It's like a reflex. It's like if you hit your funny bone and your leg goes up. That's what we're dealing with. Really primitive reflexes that are deeply ingrained and not going anywhere. Now, what we have though is layers of cortex and gray matter above that intimately communicate with that pleasure pain balance. And one of the most important areas in our gray matter cortex is actually the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that's right behind the forehead. The prefrontal cortex is really important to things like narrative and storytelling, which is really important when you think about the 12 steps. It's important to future planning. It's important to delayed gratification and future consequences. So, and it all works through language, and language is essentially a tool. Language in the course of evolution is probably one of the most important tools that humans discovered. And so what happens, I think, in 12 steps, in addition to this signature moment of loss of control and acknowledging our own helplessness around this problem or whatever it is in your life, then there's the process of narrating our story. And the story that we evolve over time is really, really important. It's not just a way to organize the past. It actually predicts future actions, because the narrative in the story then becomes what informs the way that we regulate our pleasure pain balance, because there are clearly huge communication neurons between the reward pathway and the prefrontal cortex. It's like, if you look at the brain, it's like a superhighway there, lots and lots of communication. And what we postulate, and there's some science to show this, happens in addiction is that there's essentially a disconnect between the prefrontal cortex and the reward pathway. They're not talking to each other the way that they should be. And so then what happens is the reward pathway, this reflexive, primitive, lizard part of our brain just takes over and nothing is controlling it. So part of the 12-step process, in addition to giving it over and that spiritual transformation, is the storytelling and how we tell our story and who's the good guy and who's the bad guy and whose fault it really is and what really happened, and not what the story that I have been telling or that I'd like to tell or that I'd like other people to know about. And that story then ultimately gives us the capacity for regulating that reward pathway. In my book, one of the things I talk about, which I prescribe to patients, which I essentially learned from my patients, is radical honesty and the importance of telling the truth about everything, even small things. And I looked into the neuroscience of honesty, and I found this really fascinating study where they had subjects engage in a die rolling task, and only they could see the results of the die, but on the computer, it came up what result would give them what was a winning number. And so they had people do this task, and people lied, because we have good data showing that the average human tells 1 to 2 lies per day. We're all liars. And so, they could tell people were lying based on like the 50% benchmark, based on, what should have come up based on probability. So they could tell, how often people were lying. Then they took transcranial magnetic stimulator, which is a way to create an electrical current in the brain that can change blood flow. And they applied that TMS current to the prefrontal cortex. And when they did that, they found that lying went down, which is really, really fascinating, right? Just by stimulating that prefrontal cortex, people lied less in this die rolling reward interface. So I contacted that neuroscientist, and I said to him, that's really fascinating that stimulating the prefrontal cortex makes people more likely to tell the truth. Is it possible that actively setting out to tell the truth might stimulate the prefrontal cortex? So they stimulated the prefrontal cortex to get the truth telling. I wondered, could truth telling actually cause stimulation? And he thought that it could. What wires together, what fires together, wires together. And I think clinically that is what happens. So when we consciously and effortfully commit to truth telling, that is an effortful task that engages the prefrontal cortex, that stimulates the prefrontal cortex, and that keeps us able to manage our reward pathway in a way that I think really is fundamental to recovery.
Okay. So you got to read the edging document. Would you be able to answer how it may restore recovery and healthy dopamine levels? And, what are we to expect, if we
Yeah. So the edging document is totally compatible with the neuroscience. So remember, if you think about this pleasure pain balance, we know that if we do something that's highly pleasurable, i.e. addictive, we get this huge and sudden spike in dopamine. The fundamental difference between things that are addictive and those that aren't, like broccoli, is that things that are addictive release a lot of dopamine and release it all at once in the reward pathway. But immediately it's followed by a plummeting of dopamine levels, not just to baseline, but below baseline. That's the dopamine deficit state, that state of craving, that state of wanting more. If we wait long enough, homeostasis is restored and we're back to baseline. If we don't wait, then this initial spike gets shorter, and then that plunge gets longer and stronger, and we stay down there longer. Okay, really interesting experiment done about 20 years ago in mice, where they trained mice to press a lever to get cocaine. And of course, what they saw with the cocaine that went immediately entered the intravenous system after the pressing the lever, because the mice was connected to a wire that delivered cocaine intravenously, was that the mouse would essentially press that lever more and more and more, and faster and faster and faster per unit time, until it essentially exhausted itself or died. Then they did a kind of a corollary of that, where they trained the mouse to know that when they saw a light or heard a bell, that if they went and pressed the lever, they would get cocaine. And if there was no light or bell, they wouldn't get cocaine. And then they tracked dopamine levels. And what they found was that once the animal knew that the light was a signal for getting cocaine, that when the animal saw the light, there would be a small spike in dopamine, not as high as when they got cocaine, but nonetheless a reward. So just being triggered or reminded is in and of itself a dopamine hit. But here's probably the most fascinating and important part of this experiment. Right after seeing the light with that little elevation in dopamine, it was followed immediately by a decrease in dopamine below baseline levels. So just being triggered sets off that cycle of intoxication and then withdrawal, a little mini withdrawal. And then of course that mini withdrawal is what drives the motivation and craving to do the work, to go press the lever. And once we get into that little physiologic state, really there's no stopping us, right? Because now we're in craving, we're not at baseline. It's that craving, it's that, the pleasure pain melts to the side of pain that then drives it. So the edging document is, just right on. You can't be seeing those lights that are reminders. Further along in recovery, I think people can get to that place where that they're not the physiologic slave of that process. But in early recovery, you have to eliminate all of that.
Awesome. So what does trauma look like if it shows up in sobriety, and how do we handle it?
Yeah, so again, I'll just start with an interesting animal study. If you train the same rat and you get it to press the lever for the cocaine, and then you take the cocaine away, eventually that pressing the lever compulsion will extinguish, because the rat will learn, oh, when I press this lever, nothing comes. And then the rat will stop pressing the lever and it will go and do other things. If you then expose that rat to a violently painful foot shock, the very first thing the rat will do after the foot shock is run to the lever and start to wildly press it. And of course, that makes perfect sense, right? Because what happens when you get an injury is essentially, well, first of all, it's complicated. If you have a physical injury that's really intense, it actually causes arborization, just like cocaine. But essentially what you're telling is your body is, you need to go into survival mode. There's been an injury, go get rewarding things that will potentially keep us alive. And of course, in addiction, the brain has confused survival rewards with the thing that is our addiction. So immediately with trauma, there's or injury or emotional distress, there's going to be, you're going to be physiologically like, got to go get my thing. So I think how that plays out in real life, when I think about, clinical situations, a big part of it is anticipating stuff that's going to be coming up, that's going to be hard, putting sort of coping mechanisms and supportive resources in place to handle that. And then just having a lot of, well, I call them self-binding strategies, but barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice, so that if we do get into that dopamine deficit state and we're craving, we can, there's like a pause button between our ability, like the moment of craving and actually going and getting the drug. It's harder to get it. And then also just a lot of automatic things that we can do before we go get our drug when we know we're in trouble. And a big one, obviously, is reaching out to other people, calling our sponsor, making that human connection. That's a very healthy and a source of dopamine. We know that oxytocin, the love hormone, is released when we make a human connection. It actually binds to dopamine releasing hormones in the reward pathway and releases dopamine. So that's essentially how human connection is made rewarding. Of course, in sex addiction, all of that gets really complicated, because at the end of the day, people with sex addiction are sort of attachment people. They're people who, their drug is, human attachment. So it can, but obviously, if it's a healthy human attachment, then that's a good thing.
Okay. Is sex addiction more difficult than substance addiction, and why?
I think it's more difficult for a couple of reasons. The first one is that, drug addiction, like, you have to actually go out and get the thing. And for sex addiction, for most people, unless you're, not everybody masturbates, but a lot of people with sex addiction, that's their thing. So, you know, that like all you need is your own body, right? And your imagination. So that makes it really hard, I think, because there's almost no barrier there except for the barriers that you mentally create. And the other thing about sex addiction is just there's so much shame around it. You know, there's shame around addiction more broadly, but I think there's even more shame around sex addiction, especially in, I personally think, especially for men, and especially in these hashtag Me Too times, when, you know, any kind of sort of sexual activity, especially if it involves some form of dominance and submission, which by the way is really normal and natural in the human and animal world, but now has become politicized in a way that makes even those feelings feel like they're wrong. So those are my thoughts on that.
Okay. So, all right, this next one, does dopamine rewarding work the same way in our dreams as it does in our conscious state? And for those who suffer from sex addiction, does this make nocturnal emissions problematic for periods of during dopamine abstaining?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that again, these are such great questions and really had me thinking. And you know, there are no studies per se, you know, looking at that and dopamine levels. But I will say from my, you know, many years of treating addiction, I do think that one of the fundamental aspects of the addictive process is the fact that we control it, right? Our actions in the moment change how we feel. And that's a huge part of the appeal, that we're the ones who get to decide, you know, when and how and where and how much. And it's our go-to, right? Because it's the thing we, until it stops working, can rely upon to change the way we feel. And that's part of what makes an addiction an addiction. So I would say that dreams and nocturnal emissions, but then by definition, are really outside of that category, unless you're engaging in that thing that you know is a thing where you're having a sexual dream and you know it, and you stay there. You will yourself to stay in that dreamy space, because it's actually halfway between dreaming and fantasizing. And then, you know, that gets into the whole thing about, you know, fantasizing and what the implications of that are. And I've just really come to believe, also from my own personal experience, because, you know, if you've read my book, you know, I developed this romance addiction, that place of fantasy is, for me anyway, very much my addicted place. And so, you know, I can't, if I'm really gonna, you know, be trying to be in recovery, I have to be very aware of what's happening in that space.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. We've those are all the questions that we gave to, but I think we have some more because we got a little extra time. Ray or Bob, do you guys have some other questions?
Well, we could go to the questions that we had that we added after you sent those to Dr. Lembke.
Okay. I do not have those with me. Do either of you?
I'm sorry, John, I froze up a little bit. What are we doing now?
We've just got some added questions that either Ray or Bob have.
Yeah, could you unmute me?
Ray, you're a co-host. You can unmute yourself. In fact, you are unmuted.
All right, there we go. Yeah, I will go to those questions right now. Let's see here. The first one is there a relationship between ADHD and dopamine?
So epidemiologic data show that people with attention deficit disorder are at higher risk of developing all different kinds of addictions than people without attention deficit disorder. For a while, there was some specious data which turned out not to be true, saying that if you medicated a kid with an ADHD with a stimulant, they were less likely to develop an addiction in later life. That's turned out not to be true. It turns out that that's probably pretty neutral, that medicating ADHD in children doesn't, doesn't decrease their chance of getting addicted and doesn't increase their chance of getting addicted. I think it probably increases the chances of stimulant addiction, because I see that a lot, kids medicated and then developing stimulant addiction, and also just because of the exposure and what exposure to stimulants can do in the brain. But the bottom line is that anything that affects the prefrontal cortex and our ability to future plan and delay gratification and create these coherent narratives, which is essentially the dysfunction in ADHD. It's probably a prefrontal cortical deficit in planning and attention. Clearly, that's going to make it, potentially more difficult. But honestly, at the end of the day, I'm kind of in the school of thought that ADHD, the way it's labeled now, really shouldn't be labeled as a mental illness, and instead should just be seen as a learning difference. And that probably some of the smartest people I know and the most creative people I know have ADHD, because they drift and dream in a different way, and they see cross parallels between things that other people will never see. So I'm hoping that instead of trying to change people's brains, we can help people celebrate their brain differences and help them maximize the utility of the really amazing gifts that they have that make them different from people who are more linear thinkers.
Thank you.
Brian looks happy.
Okay, here's the next question. I'm going to actually combine two questions to ask one. Does sexual identity or sexual orientation affect dopamine levels? Male versus female, non-binary, anything like that?
Oh gosh, I don't know of anybody who's looked at that. I mean, we do have data showing that sort of LGBTQ plus folks are at higher risk for all kinds of mental health problems, including addictions, but it's really hard to know if that's physiologic. I think probably not. That's probably more, societal and trauma related. So I think, no, I just think probably not. You're going to have high libido people who are men, who are women, gay, straight. I just think that's, people who, for whatever combination of nature and nurture, develop a sex addiction versus something else.
Okay, thank you. What does a healthy sex relationship look like between a sex and porn addict and a non-addict committed partner?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. I think, really starting with transparency and like brutal honesty, that just has to be there. If that is not there, like nothing else will really work. And then I do think that, some agreement around sexual practices, sort of consensus, shared consensus. And then, when I'm working with patients in that situation, I do a lot of trying to reframe expectations around sex in a committed relationship. I think partially because of our culture, people have really sort of, I would say, inflated notions of what sex is all about in a committed relationship. It's especially a long lasting one. It's not really about the euphoria of the physical experience. And frankly, after you've had so many orgasms with the same person, like it's not even in the same ballpark of pleasurable, which doesn't make it not pleasurable, but it's sort of apples and oranges. It's really about trust and respect and honesty and loyalty and all of those things that as we age really are important. And it kind of really kind of gets out of this thing like, this is so pleasurable. I don't know. I mean, that's what I think. I'd be curious to know what others think.
Okay. Well, yeah, I wish there were a way to make that happen and satisfy all of our requirements, but I do have a follow-up to that. I do have a follow-up. You know, the expression that, oh, go ahead.
No, please.
The expression that you used before, what fires together, rewires together. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Well, would it be fair to say that if you're orgasming with your spouse or your committed partner, and there's also a high level of intimacy that's not necessarily sexual, just, you know, true intimacy, wouldn't that change the way dopamine affects your brain?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right, because then there's a lot of pleasure that comes, but the pleasure isn't focused on the moment of the feeling of the orgasm. The pleasure is woven into the fabric that is your relationship, that is occurring not just in that moment of physical intimacy, but exists in all of the interactions that you have with that person through the day. So that, you know, you're recalling in that moment, not just that you may have experienced physical pleasure or given your partner physical pleasure, which is very nice and good, but just all of the ways in which you and your partner are bonded and have done things for each other and been there for each other. And also noticing, you know, that sometimes the most pleasurable part of the encounter in an intimate relationship, the physical touch part, is not even the orgasm part. It's you know, the way that your arms are resting on each other in a moment of that physical interaction. So it's being really, you know, open and present. I think that's, you know, not being in fantasy, and having it has a different texture to it, for lack of a better word. But it's really powerful, and it's an amazing source of dopamine, and it carries over and it's interwoven, and it has with it sort of sacrifice and giving as a big part of it.
Well, thank you. This will be the last question. And if you answered this in another answer, I apologize. What effect does childhood trauma have on addictive tendencies?
Well, I mean, we know that trauma has a big impact on all mental health outcomes, and people who experience childhood trauma are certainly at greater risk for developing an addiction in adult life. I think the whole attachment theory stuff is really relevant, especially for sex addiction, because of course, again, as I said before, I really think people who specifically are driven toward developing sex addiction are really people, you know, they want that closeness and intimacy, and the sex addiction becomes a sort of counterfeit form of that. And I think many of those attachment issues can come from early childhood trauma, where we don't learn to be in, you know, trusting relationships. So we don't know how to do that, and we don't trust that we can make ourselves vulnerable and not be abused in some way. And so we're always trying to control, you know, the interaction. And so there has to be a lot of reparenting and relearning to be able to trust and be open. Yeah.
Our friend Bob has his hand raised. Can we hear from you, Bob?
Sure. Thank you very much, Ray. Anna, in our program, we say, keep coming back in a very simplistic manner. From your perspective, if someone has a slip, how important is it to come back? And from a therapeutic viewpoint, what does it really mean? Is there a buildup and you don't lose everything?
Oh, no, not at all. So I always say to my patients, you know, even if you slip or have a relapse or a full-on binge that goes on for a long time, no one can take away from you that period of sobriety, that it will always be a touchstone for you. You have that forever. And we have some really interesting data in alcohol addiction, looking at what happens to the brain in recovery. And it's really interesting because although it's probably true that the injury of addiction makes some permanent scars that never go away, what happens in recovery is people develop new circuits that reroute around those damaged areas. And those new circuits, they never go away. It's like riding a bike, they'll always be there. So, you know, if you have, so if you have a lapse or a relapse, first of all, give yourself a big hug and, you know, don't beat yourself up, but then definitely get back into your program, because you already have the kindling for recovery. It's much easier to light that fire again because you've already laid down that work. Just go back. And also something else I say to patients is that a lot of recovery, especially early recovery, is doing things that you don't feel like doing, which is really a counterculture message. Because we're always told to, like, you know, well, what do I feel? What am I feeling? You know, what should I? It's like, no, we can't trust your feelings. Like, we're not going to do what you're feeling. Do these things, these actions outside of feeling like wanting to doing them, because just doing that will get you to a place where you will be feeling better.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, back to you, John.
Anna, thank you so much.
Oh,
We're at the top of the hour, but you know, it's your call. If you know, you have anything else you'd like to discuss, or you want to take a couple of questions from the fellowship.
I would love to take questions. Unfortunately, I have an 11:30 patient that I'm supposed to see. I could potentially, you know, ask that person to wait a few minutes, but I do have something else scheduled right now.
Okay. Well,
Let me,
we're so happy to have you. Yeah, go ahead.
let me see if I can, I will email this person and just let him know that I'm going to be about 15 minutes late. Let me just do that right now.
Awesome.
Okay.
Just for you, Todd.
All right.
While you're doing that, Anna, I'll throw my question out at you. Todd, sex and porn addict. In your book, you comment on that hemostasis and how our addiction really changes that level. Can you comment? I know your book does it so eloquently, but for those who haven't read it yet, how long it takes once we stop constantly acting out and looking at pornography in other ways to get back into that level playing field?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of science behind there, and there's lots of clinical experience that it takes really a minimum of 30 days to reset reward pathways for those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off the green side of the balance and for homeostasis to be restored. The science is based on imaging studies that Nora Volkoff has done, looking at people who used hard drugs 2 weeks after they stopped using. And what she found was that in the reward pathway, their dopamine transmission is still below baseline levels. Now, she unfortunately didn't follow them out, as far as I know, to see when it normalized, but that was really informative, just to show that dopamine transmission is below baseline levels, even 2 weeks after. And in my clinical experience, those first 2 weeks are the worst. Lots of craving, lots of feeling like I'm going to feel this way forever. This is horrific. But if you just wait till, you know, week 3 or week 4, it does start to get better. And then, of course, even extended abstinence, people can feel better and better beyond that.
Thank you.
John, are you still there? I can't see you in my.
Yes.
Still here? Okay. Why don't you go ahead and take the questioners in order? I think Anthony's next.
Okay.
I just invited him to unmute. Go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much, Anna. What a very informative talk. I've got 2 questions. Just pick one if either one of these are useful. Or is there any relationship that you're aware of between dopamine and testosterone and how that works, and possibly differences between the sexes? The other one, if it's better, is you've already mentioned some things, but is there anything that can be done to sort of pump up that dopamine or get it working while you're crashing from withdrawal? Either one.
Yeah, so the first one's easy because I don't know. And the second one is that one of, I think, the best, so if you think about withdrawal as you're taking the pleasure off the pleasure side of the balance, now you're crashing to the pain side. And you really want to look for pleasurable things to restore homeostasis, but really the thing to do then is to press even more on the pain side to get those adaptation gremlins on the pleasure side. So in other words, things like exercise, intense physical exercise, ice cold water baths, or other things that are emotionally and physically challenging without being harmful, are really good things to do to speed up recovery. And there's lots of data showing that, especially with exercise, it decreases withdrawal symptoms and speeds up recovery.
All right, Brian, I've sent you an invitation for your question.
Thank you. Yeah, so I was just curious to know how, the spiritual experience interacts with dopamine when we're working the steps. How, simple as that. How does that affect it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And we don't have, there's interesting neuroscience on spirituality, religious awakenings, religious transformations, meditation, and different parts of the brain that have been identified, sort of as people go through that process. But frankly, it's not really well understood. Certainly, in the context of a kind of very sudden spiritual transformation or experience, people can have a flooding of serotonin and dopamine, but those are not necessarily pleasurable. Sometimes it can be terrifying to have, in that moment of spiritual transformation. So the bottom line is that from a neuroscience point of view, we don't really know. From a kind of like phenomenological point of view, like patterns of discovery, I think, again, what's key to that spiritual transformation is the giving it over, the humility, the trusting that although we don't know what comes next, our higher power will take care of us and will sort it out. And all of that, I think, can really reduce anxiety and help us manage withdrawal, and also help us not feel so abandoned and alone. I mean, again, I think at the end of the day, this is really about wanting to be held and attached to really the spirit, really, in a very deep kind of a way, and then trying to fill that void with these relationships or these physiological arousal.
Go ahead, John.
Hi, thank you. I'm John. I'm a recovering sex and porn addict. I really appreciate your talk today. And my question is about the dopamine homeostasis you talk about. And a person who's just like you said, maybe naturally prone to the pain side, or just doesn't have the dopamine producing system, and so is always deficit in dopamine. What is that? How the psychological, depression, anxiety, that's really a difficult thing to deal with.
Yeah, that is so hard because, and that's obviously, we know that people with co-occurring mental health disorders have higher rates of addiction, probably because they're just trying to manage, that kind of chronic anxiety and dysphoria. I mean, I think the first thing to recognize is that, the pursuit of these sexual activities works at first, but then not only does it stop working, but will actually make our depression and anxiety worse. So that's one of the key messages that I really try to get out there, that, the more we press on this pleasure side, the more gremlins we get on the pain side. And ultimately, we're going to be walking around depressed and anxious because of our addictive behaviors that are creating that dopamine deficit state. So it's really got to start with abstinence, in order to reset reward pathways. And then if folks, even with continued and sustained abstinence, continue to be dysphoric to the point where, their life is just kind of unbearable, then I really recommend considering psychiatric medications, to try to help sort of restore a baseline homeostasis. Although, as you'll see in my book, I do talk a lot about the pros and cons of even that venture. I think, ultimately, and again, not everybody necessarily will experience this, but, for me personally, it is ultimately the spiritual transformation and the spiritual piece. And, I mean, I would characterize myself as sort of a non-denominational pantheist. So it's not like I'm talking about one religion or another, but just, giving it over to God, and in those moments of despair, feeling that, I am not alone, and that this too shall pass, and or that there is some good to be gained from my suffering, that it has some meaning and purpose, if only that it helps me understand other people's suffering better.
Go ahead, Tristan.
Hi, I'm Tristan. I'm a sex and porn addict. So, Anna, thank you for your talk. And my question to you is, well, earlier on, you explained a little bit about the storytelling in the prefrontal cortex and the pain-pleasure balance in the primitive part of the brain. So I am wondering, is there like a neurological explanation for people relapsing and getting back into their addictive behaviors after long periods of abstinence? Because I think like there might be a psychological trigger that makes people feel pain basically and want to go back to their addiction. But is there also a neurological explanation?
Yeah, I mean, the neurological explanation is that, once we have become addicted, we probably have permanently changed our brain to some extent, such that we're always going to be vulnerable to relapse. And we see that, in animals, we see that, in humans across different addictions, which is why we do conceptualize addiction as a chronic relapsing and remitting disease. And that can be a hard lump to swallow, gosh, I'm going to be dealing with this for my whole life. It's depressing. But basically that's what that means, that it doesn't necessarily have to be triggered by a trauma or a stressor, that just the disease itself will make us prone to relapse. And we don't even need an external reminder. Our own euphoric recall or stinking thinking, or whatever you want to call it, can set us going again. And the physiology, the neurobiology of that really is the neural networks that we've created as part of our addictive behaviors, that we see both in the reward pathway, as well as in this communication between the reward pathway and the prefrontal cortex.
Hey, John, we've used up most of that extra time. So do you want to close this out? We don't want to keep Anna anymore. Thank you so much on behalf of our fellowship, Anna.
Yes, my pleasure. Thank you so much. And it's really great to talk to all of you, and you'll be in my good thoughts and prayers. And remember that recovery is really worth it. It's such hard work, and it's a struggle every day, but you just have to continue to believe that it's worth it.